In the spring of 1811, laborers dismantling a long-abandoned tobacco warehouse on the outskirts of Richmond uncovered something that refused to stay buried. Beneath warped floorboards softened by decades of damp and rot, they found 8 wooden boxes, identical in size and construction, arranged with deliberate care. Inside each rested a man's wedding ring and a small glass vial filled with pale medicinal powder. The rings were engraved with different names, different dates, different promises. Yet together they told a single, chilling story. Every ring had belonged to a husband of Ruth Holloway. 8 men, 30 years, 1 woman left standing. What lay within the vials unsettled the magistrates who examined them, so deeply, in fact, that the discovery was sealed from public record, dismissed as a matter too delicate for exposure. Too many powerful names, too many reputations at stake. The case was buried in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society, where it would sleep for more than 2 centuries. Tonight, that sleep ends. What follows is the story of one of the most methodical and unsettling figures in American history, and the quiet, patient violence that shaped her legacy. The story of Ruth Holloway does not begin with murder. It begins with loss, with a nation still bleeding from revolution, and with secrets that flourished in the shadows of victory. Virginia in 1780 was a land reshaped by war. The tobacco fields surrounding Richmond and Petersburg rolled green and fertile along the James River, punctuated by white-columned mansions that stood as symbols of newly claimed American prosperity. The Revolutionary War had ended only 3 years earlier, but its scars were still fresh. Loyalist estates had been seized and redistributed. Fortunes had changed hands overnight, and men who once whispered in fear now spoke loudly of patriotism. Beneath the surface, however, the war had left behind something far more corrosive than ruins. It had created opportunity for betrayal. It was into this uncertain, shifting world that Ruth Holloway arrived in the autumn of 1782. She was 28 years old, striking in a restrained, unsettling way. Dark auburn hair, pale gray eyes like winter fog. She introduced herself as the widow of Captain Jonathan Holloway, a Continental Army officer who, she said, had fallen at Yorktown. Her story was simple. She had lost her husband, her home, and her future to the war. Virginia, she explained, offered the promise of renewal, a place where grief might soften with time. But Ruth was more than a grieving widow. She spoke with the careful polish of an educated New Englander, read Latin with ease, and possessed an uncommon knowledge of medicinal plants and treatments. In an era when doctors were scarce and illness omnipresent, such knowledge was not merely impressive, it was invaluable. Ruth carried with her a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten remedies, which she claimed had been passed down through generations of her family. Richmond society welcomed her readily. The war had thinned the ranks of eligible women, and here was a refined widow of impeccable manners who could discuss politics with men and healing with women. Within months, Ruth had established herself in a modest home on Clay Street, earning her living by treating ailments ranging from consumption to nervous disorders. Her reputation grew quietly, organically. She was trusted, admired, pitied. Yet Richmond was a city built on whispered conversations. Drawing rooms echoed with rumors of men who had changed sides for gold, of supply convoys mysteriously intercepted, of patriot leaders betrayed to British forces by someone who knew their movements too well. Some suspected a hidden organization had profited from treason, but suspicion without proof was easily smothered. Those men had not only survived the war, they had thrived. It was among these men that Ruth Holloway began to move. She possessed an uncanny ability to draw the attention of Richmond's most successful citizens: tobacco merchants, shipping magnates, land speculators, political figures. One by one, they were captivated. Courtships were swift, weddings celebrated with grandeur, and deaths followed with unsettling regularity. To contemporaries, each passing seemed tragically natural. To modern eyes, the pattern is unmistakable. The first warning came from voices that were never allowed to speak openly. The enslaved people who worked in the great houses where Ruth lived with her husbands noticed the same progression every time: stomach pains, weakness, sudden collapse, death. But in a society that refused to hear them, their observations dissolved into silence. The first husband to die was Colonel Edmund Fairfax. It was a humid August night in 1783, less than 6 months after their marriage. Fairfax, a robust 45-year-old tobacco merchant, had shown no signs of illness. He was found dead in his study at dawn. His servant, Jupiter, had heard him suffering hours earlier. Not the usual sounds of work or drink, but low moans, the scrape of a chair. When Jupiter peered through the window, he saw his master doubled over his desk, clutching his stomach. Ruth stood beside him, calm, attentive, holding a steaming cup. "Drink this," she told him gently. "It will ease the pain." The colonel hesitated, face pale with sweat. He spoke of calling for a doctor. Ruth dismissed the idea. Her remedy, she assured him, had been trusted for generations. He drank. Moments later, his body convulsed. He collapsed forward, scattering papers and ink across the floor. Ruth watched in silence. Then, with deliberate care, she rinsed the cup in a basin prepared in advance, and only then began to scream. Dr. Harrison arrived at dawn to find a grieving widow inconsolable with sorrow. The symptoms suggested gastric fever, common in Virginia's climate. No wounds, no signs of struggle. The death was recorded as natural. What Dr. Harrison did not know was that Ruth's medicinal knowledge did not come from family tradition. During her journey south, she had spent weeks in Philadelphia with a disgraced physician named Dr. Marcus Wainwright. Expelled for unethical experimentation, Wainwright had devoted himself to developing poisons derived from native plants, capable of mimicking natural illness and leaving no trace. Ruth learned everything he could teach her. Then she refined it. Her journal was not a book of healing. It was a ledger of death. Colonel Fairfax's funeral was attended by the highest ranks of Richmond society. Ruth fainted at the graveside. His will, revised shortly after their marriage, left her land, gold, and the Clay Street house. Within 3 months, she was seen in the company of Captain William Randolph, a shipping magnate enriched by wartime supply contracts. Sympathy became justification. A widow, after all, required protection. Randolph died 8 months after their wedding. Once again, stomach pain. Once again, Ruth's insistence on preparing the medicine herself. Dr. Harrison diagnosed bilious fever. Within the enslaved community, the whispers grew louder. Old Caesar found a vial hidden behind a wall panel. White powder, bitter almond scent. When he showed it to Jupiter at the market, recognition passed between them without words. They began to keep their own records. Ruth remarried again and again. Judge Thomas Henley, 7 months. A digestive tonic served before collapse at a dinner party. George Carrington, Samuel Bradford, Edward Custis. Each death brought wealth. Each brought sympathy. Each tightened her hold on Richmond society. By 1789, patterns were visible to those who dared notice. And into that tightening circle stepped Dr. Marcus Wainwright himself, arriving in Richmond under the guise of starting anew. He knew what Ruth was doing, and he wanted a share. Their partnership was brief. Wainwright was found dead in 1791, a victim of his own poisons. Suicide, the magistrate ruled. Ruth attended his funeral in silence. With him gone, the last witness to her education disappeared. 7 men dead. One list nearly complete. And somewhere in Richmond, a man had begun to ask the wrong questions. Captain Jonathan Hale arrived in Richmond under the cover of routine bureaucracy. Officially, he had been dispatched to untangle lingering property disputes left behind by confiscated Loyalist estates. Unofficially, he was something far more dangerous. A former Continental Army intelligence officer, Hale had been quietly reopening wartime treason files for the federal government. He had learned, through fragmentary reports and half-burned correspondence, that a network of American collaborators had fed British forces information throughout the war, then erased themselves into respectability when independence was secured. What drew his attention was not merely the existence of this network, but its disappearance. One by one, its suspected members had died. Natural causes, physicians said. Unfortunate coincidence, magistrates agreed. But to a man trained to recognize patterns in chaos, the sequence was impossible to ignore. Hale's first meaningful lead came through Dr. Harrison. Over dinner one evening, the physician spoke cautiously, as though afraid of his own thoughts. He mentioned the unusual number of prominent men he had treated for nearly identical gastric ailments. He mentioned, almost reluctantly, that many of them had been husbands of the same woman. "She has dreadful luck," Harrison said quietly. "Yet she is attentive beyond reproach, knowledgeable, always present. I find myself wondering whether she is forever trying to save them, or whether—" He stopped, unwilling to finish the sentence. Hale did not. That night, he began his own inquiry into Ruth Holloway's past. What he found unsettled him deeply. There was no record of Captain Jonathan Holloway dying at Yorktown. No officer by that name appeared in Continental Army rolls. Ruth Holloway had arrived in Richmond with a story that dissolved under scrutiny. Her origins were a void. Meanwhile, Ruth had already turned her attention to her 7th target. Alexander Fitzhugh was among the wealthiest men in Virginia, a merchant prince whose wartime fortune had been built on betrayal. As a supplier to the Continental Army, he had quietly sold intelligence to British forces, enabling raids that cost hundreds of patriot lives. His name appeared again and again in the fragments Ruth had gathered over years of careful research. Her courtship of Fitzhugh followed the familiar pattern. She presented herself as a widow shaped by grief, yet capable, intelligent, quietly formidable. Fitzhugh was drawn to her mind as much as her sorrow. Within months, he proposed. This time, however, whispers followed. Friends urged caution, 7 husbands, 7 graves. Fitzhugh dismissed them as superstition and gossip. He defended Ruth publicly, insisting that coincidence was not evidence and that compassion should not curdle into suspicion. What he did not know was that Ruth had learned something dangerous. Dr. Wainwright, before his death, had discovered the existence of the Covenant of Prosperity, a clandestine society of men who had traded information to the British while ensuring their own prosperity, regardless of who won the war. Wainwright had known their names, he had known Ruth's targets, and he had used that knowledge to pressure her. That knowledge sealed his fate. By the winter of 1791, Ruth understood that her campaign was nearing its end. Fitzhugh married her in March. He died 4 months later, his body failing with familiar precision. Dr. Harrison found nothing conclusive, but doubt had taken root. He examined Fitzhugh more thoroughly than any previous victim. Still, Proof eluded him. Ruth's grief, however, had changed. Those closest to her noticed it first. The sorrow had grown sharper, more theatrical. But beneath it, something else surfaced. Confidence. Command. The helpless widow's mask no longer fit as comfortably as it once had. With Fitzhugh's death, Ruth had eliminated 7 members of the Covenant of Prosperity. Only 2 remained. One was Dr. Harrison himself, unknowingly entangled through his wartime service. The other was the most powerful man in Virginia, Governor Edmund Randolph. Hale uncovered the truth too late. In captured British intelligence files, he found references to an American spy network betrayed from within. Among them was mention of a woman known only as the Widow, whose husband had been exposed and executed. Cross-referencing execution records, Hale made a discovery that reframed everything. Captain Jonathan Holloway had existed. He had not been a patriot. He had been a British agent operating under deep cover. He was captured in 1779 and executed after being betrayed by members of his own network. That network had later reshaped itself into the Covenant of Prosperity. Ruth Holloway was not avenging a patriot. She was avenging a traitor. But that did not make her mission meaningless. It made it more dangerous. Governor Randolph's name appeared repeatedly in Covenant correspondence. He had coordinated intelligence flow from within the colonial government itself, hedging his loyalties until victory was assured. When the tide turned, he had betrayed his British contacts and emerged unscathed. Ruth had saved him for last. She cultivated his attention slowly. Unlike previous courtships, she did not present herself as fragile. She presented herself as useful, intelligent, politically aware. Randolph, already married, did not recoil. His wife's long illness kept her confined, and Ruth became a presence at gatherings where the governor felt seen and understood. In the spring of 1792, Randolph's wife died. Ruth observed the appropriate mourning distance, and during that silence, Captain Hale attempted one final intervention. He met with the governor privately, laying out his findings. The fabricated identity, the pattern of deaths, the connection to wartime treason. Randolph listened with interest. Then he surprised Hale. Rather than fear, the governor expressed admiration. If Ruth Holloway had eliminated traitors, he suggested, perhaps she had performed a necessary service. Perhaps her talents were being misunderstood. Hale left the meeting with dread pooling in his chest. What he did not know was that Randolph had already uncovered Ruth's true identity. He knew who her husband had been. He knew why she was killing, and he knew that he was likely her final target. Instead of running, Randolph chose confrontation. He invited Ruth to dinner in June of 1792. When he spoke her true name, her hand moved instinctively toward the small vial she always carried. He stopped her with words, not fear. He told her there were not 8 members of the Covenant. There were 9. The 9th was Captain Jonathan Hale. Hale had been the analyst, the one who identified Holloway as a liability, the one who recommended his elimination. Ruth's composure fractured for the first time in years. Randolph proposed an alliance. He believed her need for completion would bind her to him. He believed he could redirect her vengeance toward his enemies and dispose of her when she became inconvenient. He misunderstood her entirely. Ruth agreed outwardly. Inwardly, she prepared to end them both. For weeks, Richmond society saw nothing unusual. Ruth moved gracefully through gatherings. Randolph appeared confident. Hale continued his investigation, unaware that his role had been exposed. On August 15, 1792, exactly 9 years after her first husband's death, Ruth invited both men to dine at her home. Each believed himself in control. The table was set with care, the conversation polite. Philosophy crept into the air like a warning. Ruth spoke of justice. Randolph nodded in approval. Hale grew uneasy. When Ruth suggested moving to the library for brandy and honesty, all three understood that something irreversible had begun. The room was sealed, curtains drawn, servants dismissed. Ruth revealed the truth. Neither man would leave alive. Hale moved first. She blinded him with an irritant. Randolph lunged. She drew the pistol she had carried for years. The confrontation ended as Ruth had planned. By morning, the governor lay dead with a bullet wound. Hale lay broken beside him. Ruth was found bound, bruised, trembling in shock. Her story was flawless. The investigation brief, the documents burned. Justice, as she understood it, was complete. And Richmond returned to sleep. For now. The official conclusion came swiftly and without resistance. Governor Edmund Randolph and Captain Jonathan Hale, the authorities determined, had destroyed one another in a violent dispute over long-buried accusations of wartime treason. With both men dead, there were no voices left to challenge the narrative. The matter was closed. Richmond exhaled and turned its gaze elsewhere. Ruth Holloway emerged from the ordeal exactly as she intended. She was found bound and bruised, her wrists marked, her voice trembling with shock. Physicians noted her injuries and found them consistent with her account. Dr. Harrison, pale and shaken by the carnage in her library, believed her, or perhaps needed to. To doubt Ruth now would mean reopening every death that had passed through his hands over the last decade. It would mean admitting that he had been standing beside a monster while calling her a victim. He signed the reports, he offered condolences, and he let the past remain undisturbed. In the months that followed, Ruth withdrew from Richmond society. She claimed the events had shattered her health and her nerves, that the echoes of violence lingered in her dreams. No one questioned her retreat. Tragedy, after all, had followed her like a shadow for 30 years. She sold her grand house and moved to a quieter estate beyond the city, a place of measured elegance and controlled solitude. She never remarried. Publicly, Ruth became a figure of dignified absence. Privately, she became something far more enduring. With her enemies eliminated and her fortune secure, Ruth turned her talents inward, then outward again in subtler ways. She no longer needed marriage as a weapon. Influence came easier now. Letters written with gentle precision, loans extended, then quietly recalled. Secrets gathered, cataloged, and stored like tools. Men in positions of power found their paths smoothed or obstructed according to how well they aligned with her quiet expectations. No deaths followed her directly, none that could be traced. She had refined her methods beyond the need for blood. When Ruth Holloway died in 1834, she was 80 years old. The announcement in the local papers was brief, respectful, unremarkable. She was remembered as a widow who had suffered greatly and endured with grace. A woman who had lost much and asked for little. It was only after her burial that the truth surfaced. Among her effects, tucked behind false panels and sealed drawers, were documents that should not have existed. Ledgers, correspondence, and finally, the journal. Written in a private cipher, it took months to decipher. When it was finally understood, those tasked with reading it realized they were holding something unprecedented. Ruth had recorded everything, not just the names of the 9 men she had killed, but the methods, the timing, the psychological considerations behind each decision. She wrote with clinical clarity, devoid of remorse. Yet threaded through the pages was a strange, mournful devotion. Everything she had done, she believed, had been necessary. More disturbing still were the later entries. Ruth's campaign against the covenant of prosperity had not been the end of her work. It had been the beginning. Over decades, she had orchestrated the downfall of countless others. Corrupt officials exposed through carefully placed scandals, business rivals ruined through manipulated markets, lives dismantled without a single overt act of violence. Death, when it came, was often incidental. Reputation was the sharper blade. She called herself an agent of necessary justice. In one of the final entries, written in a trembling but steady hand, she reflected on what she had become. She wrote that the world had no place for people like her, yet seemed to require them all the same. That where law failed, something colder and more deliberate would always rise to fill the gap. The authorities faced an impossible choice. To expose Ruth Holloway fully would mean unraveling decades of Virginia's political and economic history. It would mean admitting that some of the state's most respected figures had risen through betrayal, and that their downfall had been guided by a single, patient mind hiding behind widow's black. The journal was sealed, the case classified, silence restored. The 8 boxes found in 1811 were returned to the archives, labeled, locked, and forgotten once more. Historians who later stumbled upon fragments of Ruth's story were struck not by the violence, but by the precision. Modern forensic specialists, studying her methods in hindsight, would note how advanced her understanding had been. Plant-based toxins chosen to mimic common illness, controlled scenes, emotional performance calibrated to expectation. She understood not only how to kill, but how people wanted to believe. Perhaps that was her greatest weapon. For more than half a century, Ruth Holloway lived openly among her peers while dismantling lives from within. She proved that the most effective predators are not those who lurk in darkness, but those who learn how to be trusted, who speak softly, who grieve convincingly, who wait. Her story lingers not because of the number of deaths she caused, but because of how easily she disappeared into the fabric of her world. She did not rage against society. She mastered it. And when her work was done, history itself helped her vanish. Somewhere in the quiet stacks of the Virginia Historical Society, the boxes remain. Rings without fingers, vials without names. A testament to a woman who understood that justice, when taken into human hands, becomes something else entirely. Something colder, something patient, something that waits.